All right, thanks guys. Hey, so welcome. We are going to talk about DoubleZero today. This is a deck that's a little less technical, and so I'm going to add a lot of color to it. But if you see a lot of like big words that aren't terribly technical, it's the state of the deck. So we are DoubleZero. We're building a new base layer physical infrastructure network for high performance distributed systems. And what this really means is like physical fiber cables in the ground as an alternative to the public internet for data transmission. This is at its core a stateless network. We are not running a custody. There's no smart contracts on the network, at least no user accessible smart contracts. This is really an alternative pathway to the public internet for high performance distributed systems. And there's a lot of reasons why we'll get into, but in short, what we've seen for years is that software was the thing holding back blockchain networks, right? You go back to 2018, you run Geth locally, good luck getting it above 400 transactions per second. That's not the case anymore. Validator clients are quite performant, from Solana to MegaETH to Reth to all sorts of other systems out there today. We're actually in a pretty good place, and the limit now is the public internet. It's not actually the software packages anymore. So here's the team. DoubleZero is two companies. There's the DoubleZero Foundation, where I am the co-founder and the director over there, and there's Malbec Labs, where Andrew McConnell and Matteo Ward are the other two co-founders of the project, operate out of. Andrew spent 18 years basically building high-frequency trading networks at Getco and the Philadelphia Stock Exchange, and then spent 7 years at Jump Trading, building their global trading and execution network. Matteo, my other co-founder, kind of a similar type of background, but more on the carrier and operations side. His actual first job out of college was working for Global Crossing, which was the first company to run fiber networks around the world. Since then, he sort of did the Flash Boys fiber stuff which transitioned into microwave towers, and now all that stuff is way too slow for high-frequency trading firms. So it's all shortwave stations and these giant, 800-foot tall towers in the fields outside of Chicago, because it's faster to bounce data off the ionosphere with a 30% packet loss than it is to do anything else nowadays. It's kind of crazy, the state of HFT at this point. But yeah, this is the problem here. Do I have a laser pointer? Hell yeah, great. Okay, so this is the problem, right? So what we're looking at here are a whole series of different ping times from Los Angeles to Singapore on a bunch of different routes. So the yellow and orange represent Inet and a different route on Inet, which is basically back and forth between LA and Singapore. What you'll see here is there's a huge amount of latency, sure, right? Latency is just a standard property of the internet, but jitter is the real killer when you look at high performance systems, and this lack of determinism and this high degree of variability. So what you see if you look sort of in the morning is that the standard latency is anywhere between 250 to about 320 milliseconds here. That's a lot of variance, right? And so every time in any sort of high performance system, when you deal with data arriving at different times, data is arriving out of order. And you have to have large buffers and large queues to be able to take in and accept all that data before you can process it. So what happens, this is kind of one of my favorite moments. What happens somewhere around 3:30? Well, the internet service provider that whoever was doing, whatever this was getting routed over was using, literally switched which undersea fiber cable they were sending data over. And this one is longer, or it's worse, one of the two. Either way, we see us going from a baseline lowest performance of, let's call that 250, 260 milliseconds, up to almost 100 milliseconds more, right? And all that happened there was one of the cable systems got congested, and because of the way routing on public internet works, you got shunted off onto a route that was less expensive for the carrier to operate on, or maybe your old route got more expensive, and so they just moved you, right? The other thing to call out here are these weird spikes, right? We have dots that are actually significantly above the mean here, and this is because on public routers, you can routinely see them holding on to packets for sometimes over a second or more. And this gets particularly pronounced when you're crossing oceans, right? You got to think about, even if you have like two-lane highways coming into each other in a 4-lane highway, there's still enough room for all the cars, but traffic slows down. The exact same thing happens on the internet. Merging and combining of data always leads to more slowdowns, And especially with the packet queuing you see here, there's a lot of variability here. The delta between the baseline and the extreme is actually more than the total latency of the system in some measurements here. And so this is called jitter. Jitter is basically a measurement of how much your ping time, your latency, varies from one measurement to the other. The blue line on the bottom is DoubleZero. As you can see, it has functionally zero jitter, and the latency is always the same. Now, this is one of our testnet lines. This is not like the highest performant link we have between LA and Singapore. And you can see at moments the public internet actually does beat just once here, I guess, does beat the performance of DoubleZero, because what happens is there are some times when the actual proper HFT lines, like when market hours are not being used, they may be actually reused for public internet traffic. But the variability here between the best time that you get on the public internet and the mean worst time, again, is huge. And so really what we are building here is a network that has like deterministic latency and extremely low jitter, and that changes the entire dynamic of what's possible in high-performance distributed systems. And I know that's like a big claim, right? But like a very practical example of this is if you can say, it's going to take me 65 milliseconds to get from my trade server to the leader, whether that leader is a centralized sequencer somewhere or it's a decentralized block builder. If you say it's going to take 65 milliseconds to get there, and I have confidence of where the market's going to be in 100 milliseconds, I will make that trade. Now, if the network variance is plus or minus an additional 50 milliseconds, well, I might be in the money. I might be now past the point in time where I actually have confidence in where the market is going to be, right? And so this lack of determinism when we're dealing with networking creates larger spreads. It creates much less, because market makers can't quote as tight, it creates much less efficient markets. There's a lot of reasons why the traditional financial space uses exclusively private infrastructure, but one of them is they always know how long it's going to take to talk from Chicago to New York over their trading systems. And for years, we've sort of just felt this was impossible to do in crypto because it didn't make any sense from that perspective. You have, thousands of validators all around the world, or even if you're running on a smaller network, you have 100 or 200 validators all around the world. That's more than the number of financial centers in the world. So how do we deal with that, right? So this is kind of a rough approximation of the OSI model applied to blockchain systems. Today, most things don't get below layer 4. Well, nothing gets below layer 4. Most things are not below layer 5, right? DoubleZero is down here. We are entirely an OSI layer 1, 2, and 3 network dealing with the hardware layer for the most part. And so this is an underlay network below existing blockchain systems. This is not some sort of software overlay network. Like BitTorrent is a software overlay network. Scion is a software overlay network. libp2p, to some extent, is a software overlay network on top of these systems. This is just to emphasize we are dealing with lower level than that. So what is the architecture of the DoubleZero network? Well, it's fiber cables, like we talked about, dedicated undersea fiber. And now we at this point don't have, of course, full cables we're running ourselves. We're usually talking about a wavelength on a piece of fiber because these systems are hundreds of millions of dollars to install, and we don't have that much of a treasury yet. But that is the long-term goal, is to actually be owning fiber cables as the foundation and then leasing them out to network contributors basically at cost. So this allows access to physical fiber networks that people contribute. Now, the key to this is multiple independent contributors. So just like in a blockchain network, if Ethereum Foundation runs all the validators, there's no reason to trust Ethereum. We have multiple independent contributors that are all contributing network links to this system. So today we have 6, which might not sound like a huge number until you realize there's only 20 tier 1 ISPs in the world, so 20 companies run the whole internet. So, being approximately 25% of the way there feels pretty decent for a less than 1-year-old startup. The other piece is we integrate FPGAs in line with the network, and these are able to offload a lot of common tasks from validators today. So signature verification is one great example of a task we can offload very easily, and deduplication of traffic is another one. So what does this kind of look like, conceptually? This is one of the graphics from our white paper that you can find at doublezero.xyz. There's a filtration ring, which is where we do signature verification, deduplication, all these other types of things. And then inside of that, we have validators and RPCs. These are validators for any blockchain that wants to adopt the network. That, instead of sort of the existing model where, if you're running a validator in a data center, you're maybe running it on TerraSwitch or Latitude or Equinix. If you're running it at your house, you're running it on Verizon, or you're running it on Spectrum, or you're running it on Charter, right? We sort of think about like home stakers as somehow more censorship resistant than something running in a data center. To some extent that's true, but like how many ISPs can you actually get at your home? If you're in New York and you're lucky, the answer is maybe 3. But for most people in the world, it's 1. And most people in the world are on an ISP that's actually owned by the government, right? In Europe, all the fiber is basically owned by the government. In somewhere like the UAE, it's all owned by the government. And somewhere in Singapore, the companies are also all owned by the government. And so when we think about censorship resistance for these things, the network level is always one that people don't pay, I think, enough attention to. And just as a side note, I think the Bitcoin boys are kind of right that if you want true World War III censorship resistance, you got to be able to validate a block on an FM radio broadcast from a satellite in space. Anything else is meaningful, but is not as resistant as people think it is. Like, I think if all the OECD countries decide to outlaw crypto, it's going to be a bloodbath, no matter how many validators you have, because the person that controls the pipes controls the pipes. So this is the DoubleZero fiber network build-out that we have today. This is not the complete thing we'll be launching on mainnet with, but these are all the lines we kind of have in and installed today. Each one of these links is 100 gigabits per second bidirectional, which, for reference is enough for about 25 Solana networks to run on standard demand, and especially when you deal with things like traffic deduplication and signature verification, we can bring that number down even more and throw out a bunch more. So there's a ton of stuff that's worth noting here. The first is, when I was talking about censorship resistance, what we mean is alternative pathways into a specific area. So you look at Tokyo here, there's 5 lines coming into Tokyo on different undersea cable systems. Now, you'll notice 2 of those go to the United States, the other goes to the rest of Europe. This is this graph needs to be more dense, right? This is the initial mainnet build out. This actually doesn't include a bunch of stuff we've put in the last few months. But the whole idea here is that you need alternative pathways so that if one network provider decides to censor you or decides to, or the cable gets cut, right? Not a crazy idea that this cable that runs from China to Russia might get cut at some point in the future. You need alternative pathways around the world. The thing is, the internet does this every day, right? If any of you have been running validators in Tokyo for high-performance networks, you might have seen a few weeks ago they weren't doing so hot in keeping up with nodes in Europe. Well, that's because there was a major subsea cable system that was down for scheduled maintenance. Now, scheduled maintenance is nothing out of the realm of possibility for these systems, but folks who run validators aren't paying attention to the cable notices. And so on Solana, for example, there were a whole bunch of people who suddenly said, wait, why am I getting penalized with vote credits? Well, the internet got worse, right? You did nothing wrong with your validator, just the physical topography of how your validator was connecting to other validators changed. And so as crypto evolves and as it gets more mature, we have to start thinking on the physical infrastructure layer side. And I don't mean ZK provers, I mean the actual physical cables under the ocean. And this is the journey that all large software companies are on, right? This started with Oracle building fiber networks initially. Today, Facebook and Meta are actually the largest investors in subsea cable systems. And it's not out of the goodness of their heart. It's not that they want to wire up everyone in the world with internet. They want to sell ads. And in order to sell ads, they had to wire up the Philippines with fiber so they could actually get enough data to people to get them hooked on Instagram and sell them ads. Microsoft is building data centers, as we all know, for AI projects. Crypto is now successful enough that we have to be thinking about our own dedicated infrastructure. Even Netflix does this, right? Zoom now is actually looking at building out fiber networks because, you think video conferencing, how timely, how much does that really matter compared to financial data? Well, the public internet's still not great at even that sort of thing. So again, high-level overview here of how this system works. At its core, we are using industry standard technology of GRE tunnels and BGP routing at the base layer. This is stuff that you will find in any high-end network nowadays. The real special part is the orchestration layer, the network controller, and the ledger that runs on top of it. So we've basically taken a bunch of systems. Private networks obviously have existed for decades and decades, but they've always been run by one centralized system with one set of admin keys. The real breakthrough for DoubleZero is we've been able to build this decentralized orchestration framework to use this existing industry standard technology. And so what this means is the controllers, for example, reach consensus on what routes packets should take to get from point A to point B on the network. That is then published to the DoubleZero ledger, which is effectively like a public/private blockchain. It's private in the sense of no one can deploy anything to it, but it's public in the sense of anyone can read and verify the data coming off of it. Again, this is not a smart contract network in the sense of like no users are deploying data to it. We are not an L1. We will never be an L1. It's really just there because blockchain is the best accounting system that anyone has ever created. And so this is really the thing that we're kind of like focused on here is you can actually have much more traceability and transparency around data flows and how data moves throughout a system than you can get on the public internet today. You have no guarantee today that your ISP is not censoring you. You have no guarantee today the ISP is not deep packet inspecting your transactions and trying to actually front run you. Now that's probably not happening, but like this is not an industry that runs on probably, at least for the most part. So I'll skip through some of these components just in the interest of time, but here's kind of a high-level like overview of the types of technologies we're bringing to the DoubleZero network. So FPGAs, as I mentioned, we can use FPGAs to offload common tasks from validators and provide this protection layer. And so we can dedupe and sig verify 100 gigabits per second line rate of malformed transactions. So these are transactions where the signatures do not match. There's zero chance this would ever be included. We're not filtering out spam in the sense of low-value transactions or like garbage NFTs or something like that, or like low market cap meme coins. We're just filtering out things that are literally garbage and have no chance of ever getting into the blockchain, or there are many duplicate transactions that are literally identical in the way they're formed. You can create DDoS attacks that have individualized packets and those sorts of things so that they wouldn't be caught by the dedupe, but really this is about increasing the cost of attacking a distributed system. Solana alone has suffered 80 gigabits per second of DDoS attacks before. On those are all situations where it's very similar packets or it's malformed transactions where the signatures wouldn't match anyway. And so that's kind of what this filtration layer is built for. We're also able to do things like QoS prioritization of data flows within FPGA. So for example, in a moment where a network is under attack and there's a flood of data coming into it, should probably prioritize votes and state transitions, votes and state propagation over, say, transactions, right? So this allows a high-performance network to fall into something akin to a safe mode where, like, for maybe a while you're turning off transactions to allow the network to recover. This is already sort of a mode that's built into Solana. It's not really used much, but validators can sort of assert this. But we think this is actually pretty important when you're looking at how can a high-performance system recover, right? One of the great properties of Bitcoin is if hash power goes offline, the network just gets super, super, super slow, right? You never have to restart Bitcoin. It's just the math eventually adjusts to whatever the hash power available on the network is. That, Ethereum has its own version of this with, two competing forks slashing each other down. But we think there's kind of a version of this also that applies to networks that want to use DoubleZero, but also need the ability to fall back to the public internet. Because the whole point of this thing is if we are always limited by the speed of the public internet as the limiting factor for how fast blockchains can go, we have no hope of ever competing with Binance. We have no hope of ever competing with Coinbase or TradFi or anything along those lines because those systems run on private networks. They're always going to be faster. And so we can make the argument that decentralization, self-custody, security is worth paying for, but how much so? Are you willing to take a 10x performance hit, a 100x performance hit, a 1000x performance hit? And we've seen systems like Hyperliquid that don't offer any of those types of things, gaining huge amounts of market share because users don't care until they're educated enough to care, and we can't just rely on everyone being a good person and understanding the values and morals of decentralization for these systems to really gain adoption and support. Multicast, this is, I think, the last piece of technology I'll have time to talk about today, but multicast is one of the coolest things that we're able to do on DoubleZero. So multicast is a technology that all of you have encountered in your daily lives today. It's AirPlay, it's Sonos speakers, it's the ability for one data feed to end up in multiple locations. Now you can't do multicast over the public internet. It's just not supported on any ISP. But multicast is how all traditional financial markets run. Pricing feeds for financial markets are distributed via multicast feeds. And multicast is basically hardware acceleration for packet replication. So if you look at RaptorCast on Monad or Turbine on Solana, what's happening is the validator is sending out copies of the data to 200 nodes, and then they're sending it out to 200 more, and those are sending it out to 200 more. Most networks have some version of this because otherwise the demands of bandwidth on an individual validator are absolutely massive. The thing here that's really important to note is that's a tax. Every additional validator is a bandwidth tax and a performance tax on the network. With multicast and your ability to do this in hardware replication, you get rid of that problem because all the data replication occurs as close to the edge as possible. So if you take an extreme example where you have one validator in London and 1,000 validators in New York City, if that validator in London produces a block, it is not sending 1,000 copies across the Atlantic. It's sending 2 copies across the Atlantic. And then the switches at the end are replicating that data to get it to all of the places that it needs to go. This is like a massive, massive savings in bandwidth. It is also a massive performance unlock for distributed systems because you're not having to rely on all the other validator networks now to distribute blocks. This can be done at a hardware acceleration level of the network, which can also be cryptographically verified. You're not compromising any security. The data is moving the same way it would on an existing system. It's just moving using a different transport protocol. And that's kind of the major unlock here. And you still have recovery and failback mechanisms where you can basically switch back to a gossip, which is effectively BitTorrent to like recover any data you're missing. You can put erasure coding on multicast feeds, right? You can deal with high packet loss. Not that these networks have that. But all these types of things do exist within this technology stack as well. And I think that's one of the things that when I look at like how do you get networks like a Mega ETH or a Monad or a Solana able to run 100,000 transactions per second with multiple sequencers all around the world or a 2,000 validator cluster, multicast is the real solution to be able to do this and not suffer massive performance hits. I think the thing to leave you with on multicast and these types of dedicated networking is you look at Solana with 1,300 validators and its transaction per second capacity. There is nothing remotely close to Solana's number of validators that's doing anywhere near that number of transactions. And that's not accidental. That's because data replication is really hard. Data replication is what's holding back blockchains from reaching higher potential. This is why if you're running a hyperliquid validator, you're doing it in Tokyo, right? You can't have hyperliquid work and have a validator in New York City and a validator in Tokyo. There's just too much latency over the public internet for these systems to synchronize correctly. This is why single sequencers will always be regional blockchains because there's always an incentive to co-locate next to that sequencer. No one trades on Base from Asia for the most part, and no one from the United States trades on BNB for the most part. There's a reason for these types of systems. And so the sequencer model can totally work, but you need multiple sequencers around the world. You need a system to rotate and hand those off to make sure there's some level of fairness and distribution globally, where you end up with systems that are inherently regional, the same way the New York Stock Exchange is an inherently regional market. So I think that's about what I'll leave you with. The only other piece here is prioritized routing, which is one of the really cool pieces that we're going to be able to do, which is basically bringing metrics similar to high-frequency trading to blockchain for the first time. So you will be able to say, if you are, for example, doing a MEV transaction or an arbitrage or something of high value, that, hey, I want to pay to make sure this is always going over the fastest fiber link possible. All the fiber links on DoubleZero are fast enough for state transitions, they're fast enough for votes, all these types of things. But if you are someone who's saying, like, look, I'm already paying priority fees on Flashbots or Jito, I want to make sure my data gets to the Jito or the Flashbot block builder as quickly as possible, and then that block builder can deliver it to the leader wherever that leader is in the world, networking is your biggest bottleneck of time at the moment. It's not how long it takes Flashbots or Jito to build a block and include that. It's the data transmission to and from those systems. And so prioritized routing And basically data prioritization is the main thing we're looking at over the long term to both monetize the network and decrease costs for validators. It would be awesome in the future if this network is entirely subsidized by traders, and so protocols and network systems can actually operate on it for functionally zero cost. Because the businesses, for lack of a better term, running on top of these systems are paying for all of the cost of it. Great. Here's where you can find some more info, and I will be outside. Thank you.